Hey students, this is going to be hopefully a relatively quick video. Tonight, because this is Tuesday, you're going to be turning in your first assignment, which is a memoir essay. And what I would like to do today is to talk a little bit about the necessity of discomfort, of being a little uncomfortable in your writing, and of leaning into that. Um, you can see a lot of sort of motivational speakers and even TED Talks about the importance of not avoiding but leaning into discomfort. And there is definitely a real value to that in writing. Um, and when I first started writing, I'd been actually going to a lot of therapy because I had been in a traumatic event. It was in a car accident where I lost both my wife at the time, Susan, and my son, Cyrus. And this is subject matter that I've continued to write about ever since then. And one of the things that came up that I remember very clearly was how hard I tried to not do the work of therapy. Um, and it wasn't really intentional. It was just kind of baked into who I was. I had a view of who I was as a very strong, very capable, very masculine, for lack of a better word, identity. And I was going to sort of white knuckle my way through grief and trauma. Um, Fortunately, I had a very, very good therapist who was even better at spotting avoidance than I was at acting out avoidance. And I had all these avoiding techniques, like first of all, my constant need to tell my therapist that I was okay and prove to her that I was okay, which was ridiculous because I was suffering from chronic pain from the accident. And of course, I had lost my oldest son and my wife in a car accident. And here I am trying to prove to my therapist that I'm just fine. Um, some other things that I would do is avoid the question, change the question, try to weirdly turn it back around to her, take her question and ask a question in return, or appeal to things that other people have said to me that I didn't even necessarily believe but hadn't really thought about. And one of the things I learned through that was that instead of getting at the truth and really taking control and hold of my story, I was avoiding my story. And it was by in effect, as a result of that, taking control of me, that I was not steering the ship in any way because I wasn't even willing to walk in and take control of the wheel. So um, so what I want to talk today about is the necessity of leaning into discomfort and some things to think about, some ways to avoid avoidance, and to also to ask yourself the healthy and interesting questions that allow you to create sophisticated, complicated thinking in prose. So I'm going to share a little handout here that I have. And leaning into instead of away from discomfort. Let me increase this just a little bit more. All right. So a couple of things I think that you can be thinking about. So avoidance behaviors are any actions a person takes to escape from difficult thoughts and feelings. These behaviors can occur in many different ways and may include actions that a person does or does not do. In writing, avoidance manifests itself through a series of unconscious and self-protective actions. All right, and I'm going to go through these. And the example I'm going to give for an essay that completely avoids avoidance is the essay by Danielle Cadena-Doolin that I had you read about her brother who had autism. And I believe that version of the essay was called Aperture. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. When I reference ways in which she doesn't do that or avoids doing that. Okay, first of all, the absolute killer to essays are when a writer feels like an essay should have a takeaway. So essay as motivational poster. And you see this posters of like mountains and people climbing them, and they have little platitudes at the bottom that are supposed to be inspirational. Do not write essays that do that. When you should avoid hiding behind easy platitudes, received knowledge, things that people have told you and therefore you've assumed to be true, whether or not you've actually ever thought about them. Unexamined appeals to authority. Well, according to this person, or Freud always said, or according to Foucault or Sartre. I mean, you can quote those people, but only to engage with them, not simply to drop them into your essay in the place of thinking. And cliches. After the death of my son in an auto accident, I had someone say everything happens for a reason, and my response was, "Oh, really? So there was a reason my son flew through the windshield of a van, and there's a reason for that." The truth is, if they are, we don't know them. We won't know them as writers. We're not meant to know them as humans, and that's humility. But sometimes things just happen, and that's one of the hardest things to deal with. The hardest thing to write about is an accident, because it's purposeless, and makes us face the sometimes absurd nature of our condition. 2, a refusal to address the question at hand or even ask them. So for the example, in my case, it would be, why did I let my kid in a van with no seatbelts in the car? How do I talk about that in a way that just doesn't berate myself for it, even though I still feel like I'm deserving of some berating, but thinking about how do you get into a mental place where that's suddenly okay, and not just me, but a whole bunch of other adults who were in that van. But you still have to ask that question. That's an important question. And to what extent am I responsible? To what extent am I not responsible? And what does it mean to take responsibility? This is a similar question that's being asked in Aperture when the writer is asking herself why she's saying sorry. The brother says, why are you sorry? You didn't do anything. And that's the point. She's trying to hold herself accountable for not having done anything to protect him. Even though that's somewhat unfair, she's at least exploring the issue and asking the difficult question. Projection. This connects a little later to this idea of separating the world into allies and enemies. Projection is when we basically try to put all the blame for an event in possession of one character. Sometimes these come off as victim narratives. Certainly, there are times in our lives where we are not responsible for what has happened to us. In other words, no one should ever tell someone who is a victim of sexual assault that they were ever in any way responsible for what happened to them. Like questions like, what were you wearing and did you say no, that come up. These are all ways of trying to put the blame on the wrong person. But to ask oneself the question of, why was I targeted? What were the steps that led me to this place? How do I make sure that I'm never in this place again? Those are more productive questions. In some ways, people were victims before they ever became victims because they were groomed to be, and they need to figure out like how that happened. And that's a really interesting and compelling question. That's not beating oneself up or taking an appropriate level of accountability, but exploring what makes a victim and how does one stop being a victim. The application of templates, like the journey templates, which implies that we're all in a journey. We go through a series of events that we have to overcome certain things, and then we reach sort of self-realization. The real problem with that is not that that doesn't happen to people. It's that the sense that every essay needs to follow that pattern, or that a life does. You need to be very careful. Or epiphany narratives. And then all of a sudden I became aware of, in the middle of a narrative, which is kind of a testimonial narrative. And usually narratives in which I used to be this way, but now I'm better, read it to us as dishonest. Imagine if someone were to write an essay about their alcoholism, in which at the end of the essay they said, and I'm no longer an alcoholic. Well, you rightfully say, no, you're always an alcoholic. You're always going to be struggling with these things. And that's true about anything that we experience. We don't just get fixed. We are followed by ourselves. You can't run away from yourself, and you can't run away from your experiences and nobody is fixable, which is also another way of saying maybe you don't need to be fixed, that maybe you just need to understand yourself better. We're all struggling to be, we're animals struggling to be humans, expected to be angels, and we have to come to grips with what that means in human experience. Um, Narcissism. This is kind of a problem in essays when students refuse to recognize that there are other people in their world and they have their own thoughts. And this mostly gets manifested in intent. When you tell a student, do you realize that you could be coming off as slightly misogynistic here, or racist or homophobic? A student gets irate and angry because they had no intention of coming across that way and they don't see themselves that way. Intent isn't all that matters. If I say something that offends one of you, um, and you tell me about it, my response should not be, what's wrong with you? My response should be to listen, to try to understand what it is that I said that has offended you, and to alter my behavior in a way that takes into account the validity of your experience and point of view as a human being. If I don't do that, I am a narcissist. So my point of view isn't the only one that exists in the world. My intentions are not all that matter. There are other people in the world who I have hurt and that I have affected in various ways. I have to recognize the truth of that and not simply constantly be defending myself. Defensiveness is death to an essayist. Really a good artist exhibits a radical openness, not just to the various input that they're experiencing from the world in a sensory way, but also a recognition that there are many equally valid ways of looking at the world, and that there are all these other people out there who have legitimate points of view and backgrounds. The other side of narcissism is self-loathing or self-abnegation. Self-loathing, self-abnegation is when one berates or themselves. They basically say they're the worst person in the world, which is crazy if you think about it. I guarantee that none of you are worse than Hitler. And you're on the spectrum of good and bad. You're probably somewhere in the middle with the rest of us. You're struggling. You're trying to be good, which is the most that can be expected, really, on a day-to-day basis. We're flawed. But when one starts to say, I am a terrible, terrible human being, that's actually its own kind of avoidance, because it basically says that you're irredeemable, and you are not. And to say you're irredeemable is to give up responsibility for one's own soul, which you don't want to do. And also makes for a very flat character, and you are a character in your own work. Separating the world into allies and enemies, into good and bad, into positive and negative. These are very Western concepts that follow us around and limit the abilities of our writers and our thinkers and our politicians and our people. There's a whole lot of gray out there, and gray is the part of the world that the writer explores. It's the complexities, the difficulties, if you've villainized a character, you turn a character in your life into a cartoonish version of an evil character, then you have not done your job. A good example of this would be the father in Aperture, who is definitely abusive, and you should not like him, but he's complicated, and he's delivered to the reader in complicated ways. And one point, in a very heroic way, when he defends his wife and her baby against this horrible human being who wants her to have it aborted because he wants to be a politician and doesn't want to be responsible for that baby. This is all a product of 5, 6, and 7. Like when you are narcissistic or self-loathing, you will tend to separate the world into allies and enemies. A refusal to participate in the world of ideas, which is just shutting yourself off to all sorts of ways of thinking about the world. Even though I don't want you simply quoting Freud at me, you should probably go out and read yourself some Freud. You should probably read yourself some C.G. Jung. You should probably find out and do some reading around in behavioral psychology. If you're writing about something and it touches on profound ideas or issues, or science, you should do that kind of research and find out what other people have had to say about it or think about it. When you ask the question why, you cannot be the only source of the answer, for the answer. This should be wrote. Misogyny, bigotry, racism, sexism, homo or transphobia or xenophobia are horrible blocks to any writer. If you possess those traits and they start coming out in your writing, they're going to limit what you're capable of doing as a writer. This is not to say that anybody is free of these things, that we all exhibit these attributes at different times. It's part of how our brain compartmentalizes. But be very, very wary of them and call yourself out on them. The way to call yourself out on them is to ask yourself continually, is there a way that a reasonable person might look at this to be misogynistic? Or forget reasonable, because who's reasonable? If a person who was homosexual, or who was a woman, or was trans, or was African American, or of another race than you, whatever that race might be, were to read this, would they see it that way? And then think about why. Finally, holding on to unexamined beliefs. This is a tough one. I'm a religious person. I'm Episcopalian, Christian. I have beliefs that I hold on to, probably in spite of lots of evidence that would counter it. But I try to be as open-minded as possible without letting my brain fall out. And I'm constantly examining my belief systems, not only for whether or not they are true, but what actually they serve and who they serve. Are my beliefs self-serving? Are they self-congratulatory? Are they self-protective? Do they have any basis in experience or truth? And are they harmful to others? I do ask those questions. How to avoid these things? Some things that you can try to do to go beyond it. Even though, for example, Danielle Cadena-Doolin in Aperture is asking the question about whether or not she's responsible for her brother's abuse. To what extent was she complicit in it? She doesn't feel the necessity to answer that question fully. She implies a lot of possible gradations of complicity. And this is the thing. She's well beyond the need to be right or fixed or okay. She is okay with not being okay, with being incomplete and fallible, and having made some choices that she wishes that she could go back and change, recognizing that if she were to go back, she probably couldn't have changed them. Remember, she was just a girl when all this was happening. While still holding yourself accountable for your role in events, you should be asking yourself this question: how was I a participant in the story? And I'm quoting that moment from You Didn't Do Anything. When the brother says to Danielle, you didn't do anything, that's meant ironically. The reader knows that that's exactly the problem, and that she was a part of the story, and she's trying through the writing of this to accept her role in it. Try to get to that second level of insight, not just what do I think about this, but why do I think that? And what did I think then? Why did I think that? What do I think now? Why do I think that? What are all of the factors that are operating on you that are contributing to your point of view and to your understanding? Also, this is also known as critical thinking, or thinking about thinking, which we talk a lot about at the university level. Ideally, creative nonfiction should be a tool for critical thinking. Realizing that human beings are complex, all of them, even the bad ones, and that all of them are capable of good and evil, and that everyone has a story that has led them to the moment that they are in. Leaning into discomfort is not just about telling a difficult story. It's about exploring what is significant about the story, your story, about asking us how this story tells us more about ourselves and about what it means to be human. It is a constant returning to the difficult questions that we ask ourselves and never being satisfied with easy answers. And also, by the way, being aware that those answers could change as you change. That the significance of something that happened in your past may change and alter simply as your life circumstances and experiences change and alter. And of course, that event and experience might mean something entirely different to someone else. If you've already decided what an event means, why it happened, and what you think about it, it's probably not worth writing about anymore. That's a hard thing to be aware of. Sometimes we've decided that this moment, this is the most, like whenever anybody says, let me tell you a story. It's the most important moment of my life. And they tell you the story. And it's usually an incredibly boring story. And it's boring only because that person is telling you, because this story is something they've decided, they know what this event means to them. They understand completely why it's significant. The stories that interest me the most are the ones when people tell me, I'm like, what's wrong? And I can just tell something's wrong. And I'm like, well, what's wrong? And he's like, this thing just happened to me. And I don't know how to feel about it. And then they tell me the story. That's interesting. Because when the writer says, I don't know how I feel about it, when they're inviting me to participate in the process of trying to figure it out along with them. Writing essays are tools for discovery. We're not trying to prove anything. We're not conquistadors conquering South America and claiming land for the church. We are discoverers who are actually listening and paying attention and trying to learn. And that's how an essay is a tool for discovery. That as you are writing, you should be learning more about yourself and about your world and discovering things you never knew were there. That's what we're looking for. Hopefully this was helpful and gets you to that second level of thinking. And if you're not there yet, you're not there yet. That's kind of the reason that I'm having you turn in drafts, is so that we can talk about how to get you there. So even if this isn't helpful to you now, you've already done this, so you've turned it in, now you're going, oh my God, what did I do? Don't worry about it. This can be used as the basis for your revision process. And there will be a short journal activity that's going to be directly based on this particular handout, which will also be available. Hopefully this will all connect. I hope you're all well, stay safe, and I hope to see all of you soon, because we're going to do Zoom meetings, signups very soon. Thank you.